Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. In the first story, we'll do a little tutorial on how to fight against noisy neighbors. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. To sleep, perchance to dream. For the first few years after we graduated, the wife and I lived in an apartment. Nice place, but of course the walls were paper thin. Life was good until we got new neighbors, a pair of guys who would play their stereos super loud until 2 or 3 a.m. during the week. Kept us and other neighbors awake and miserable. They mainly did it on weeknights because they would work/be gone from the apartment almost every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Life became really sucky. Their speakers were up against the common wall to our bedroom, which made it completely impossible to sleep. We and other neighbors tried talking with them, even calling the cops, never got more than a few days respite, then they were right back at it. They were also a-holes in other ways. It got to the point where it was affecting my job performance. I worked at a big defense systems company as an engineer and had several electrical engineer friends. One of them made me what he called an interference box. It was basically an amplifier with a variable power output that I could put near the common wall that would cause massive distortion and noise to come out of any speakers within a 10 to 20 foot radius. Made it impossible to use their system. I got to where I would turn it on around 10 p.m. and leave it on all night. It made a bit of a buzzing noise itself, but not bad. I just cover it with a couple of pillows and I could sleep. If I turned it all the way up, it would also mess with their and my TV. These guys tried all kinds of things to fix their stereo, bought new and bigger speakers, line filters, etc. Nothing worked. I'd hear them bitching about the situation and grinding each other's gears over who had broken the system. They eventually got the apartment's complex maintenance people involved, but that didn't help either. Life was good again. One day they packed up and moved out, skipping out on their lease. They were not missed. New neighbors were quieter than us. Stayed in the apartment until we bought our first house 6 months later. And our second story. You won't give me my car back? The car that's in my name and I pay for? Fine. Before I met my now husband, he was married and divorced. We'll call my husband H and his ex-wife D. Theirs was not a marriage of love, but a marriage of financial benefit. He was 19, she a little older. He was in college, but she couldn't afford to go. He was able to get grants and some small loans to afford college because his parents were dead broke. Her estranged father made too much money to qualify, so they got married. So the powers that be no longer considered her parents' income into her ability to pay part of the application for grants. He worked in commercial real estate and went to school part-time. With his income and both their grants and loans, she was able to go to school full-time, and they graduated at the same time. They stayed together through and a little bit after college, although they didn't really love each other. They did like each other. He started making a decent living and learned to appreciate the finer things in life. His upwardly mobile career allowed them to buy and sell their first house, then buy a second, nicer home. He also leased them both brand new cars. In 2000, my husband started to feel like their time together had passed its prime. She agreed. They started the divorce process, and since her job didn't pay that much, ETA, they sold the house for loss during their divorce process, so nobody got that. He decided to give her all the furnishings in their home, paid for by him, agreement to finish out the remaining months on her very nice SUV's lease in his name, and $500 plus per month, ETA, which, if included in the divorce decree and not as a separate agreement attached and referenced in the decree, is considered alimony in our state, regardless if it's called by the name alimony in the decree or not, and as such can be altered if the supported spouse remarries or either party has a significant change of income. In this case, she remarried, her marital income more than tripled, and H's income was $0 for an, at the time, unknown period of time. Half of his, not inconsequential savings in retirement accounts, 100% funded by him. She always spent any money she had left after bills on shoes and clothes, never opened or contributed to a savings account. He was very generous, considering our state would not have required he pay any alimony and only a split of commingled assets, and he had come into the marriage with a small sum of savings he never commingled that he could have kept. They used a divorce-in-the-box type place that does non-contested divorces on the cheap. They were amicably divorced 90 days later and both dating their future spouses within a few months of that. My husband and I started dating in early 2001, 2 to 3 months after the divorce was final. A year and a half after the divorce, I moved in with my husband and she married her extremely well-off financial boyfriend. My income could just barely cover all our bills, my soon-to-be car payment, my car was on its last legs and I desperately needed a new car, and his car payment, but I didn't have enough to cover his ex-wife's $500+ per month car payment. He decided that since Dee was remarried, he should not have to continue paying for it and should be able to take the car back, and I could drive that instead of buying a new one myself. He thought it was fair, and he read his divorce decree and felt it was possible. We consulted a lawyer who agreed that asking for it back was fair, and although it wasn't written into the divorce decree as alimony, it will likely be treated as such if they ended up going to court. So he had a good chance of winning. H called Dee to explain the situation. He asked for the SUV back, but she said no and ended the conversation. He called her a week later and asked again, stating that if she still refuses, he will take her to court. She said she'd spoken to her husband and they weren't going to give the car back. As an alternative, H asked if they could take over paying all or at least some of the car payment, as the $500 plus per month would negatively impact his career advancement. They said they spoke to a lawyer and refused to pay a penny of the payment. On to the next option, court. Our lawyer had laid out a plan for doing it without representation, so he went to the courthouse the next day and filed his complaint. A few days later, Dee calls and says she'd been summoned by the court and she and her husband wanted to come over and see if they could work something out without going to court. Great. We figured she'd seen that these $500+ car payments were basically alimony, and she really can't have her ex-husband paying for her car now that she's remarried. She's seen the light. The night she and her husband came over, their solution was not to give the car back. No, their solution was he turn in the $500+ per month vehicle, pay the early lease termination penalty, and get her a new 36-month lease on a different, cheaper car, say a $250 one. Considering there were 18 months left on the $500+ a month, that would actually cost him more money in the long run with the penalty. That was a big no. ETA, H just reminded me, we made a third attempt at a compromise. We asked that they take over the payment until the time at which his income returned to the pre-divorce level by agreeing to share his pay stubs on a monthly basis to verify he was still below thresh. Once he was back to earning what he was at the end of the marriage, he would take over the payments again. She said, well, I talked to a lawyer, and he doesn't think you have a snowball's chance in hell of winning in court. H. Okay, have a good night. Bye. And out they went, feeling like they won. The revenge. Court date came, and H shows up in court. D. Nowhere to be seen. His case gets called, still no D. The judge reads the complaint, listens to H's story, and makes his judgment, paraphrasing, I don't think my ruling would be any different had she showed up to court, but we'll never know. I hereby declare a default judgment in favor of the plaintiff. Once H received a printed copy of the judgment, he hatched his plan. 1. He called D, told her he'd won the case and asked her for the keys. She said no and hung up on him. 2. He went to the dealership to order 2 new keys. He had the VIN and the car was his, so no problem there. 3. He knew where she worked and her schedule. He ordered a tow truck and requested a sheriff's officer at 3:45 for the next afternoon at her work. D-Day, 3:45 the next day. 15 minutes before she would finish, he met up with the tow truck driver and the officer in the parking lot of her work. The officer verified the documents, and they located and loaded the truck onto the flatbed. They moved the truck to the curb right outside the doors to Dee's work. A little after 4, Dee walks out, sees the trio and her car on the truck, and freezes in her tracks. This is the paraphrased conversation that followed. D. But you can't do that. H hands her the judgment, and the officer reiterates the court's judgment. D. But I talked to Joe. He said you didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning. Those were Joe's exact words. Snowball's chance in hell. Voice slightly cracking. H thinks for a second to try to figure out who Joe was. She'd said it like he knew who Joe was. He tried to figure out a lawyer they both knew named Joe, but he could only think of their mortgage broker, Joe. H. Joe? Joe like our mortgage broker, Joe? Your lawyer is a mortgage broker? Yeah, He said that it wasn't written into the divorce decree as alimony, so you couldn't take it just because I got married. H. Well, the judge may or may not have agreed with you and Joe, but since you never showed up to court, you lost your opportunity to find out. She was left mouth opened, catching flies. He shook the officer's hand, thanked him for his time, said to the truck driver, "I'll meet you back at my house," said goodbye to D, and walked away. Just when H neared his car, she screamed, "How am I supposed to get home?" He replied, "Call that pansy butt of a man you call a husband that was okay with his wife's ex-husband supporting her." They get back to our house, unload the tow truck, and the driver was laughing his butt off. When he was finished, he said, "That was the best thing I've ever been a part of on the job." He ended up discounting the tow by a bit, saying that it's to make up for you having to be married to that entitled woman. I sold my SUV within a week, and I took over the payments for his ex's car. Their divorce was no longer amicable. We got married, had a kid, and lived happily ever after. And our last story. Sue me? Okay, I will. My nephew bought a car transmission on a well-known auction site. A few days later, he received a crate. He opened it and it was full of junk parts, just some old brake rotors and junk to have the crate weight what the transmission would have weighed. Of course, he contacted the seller and they claimed they sent a transmission and refused to do anything. My nephew got a bit heated and an argument ensued, and the seller finally told him if he didn't like it, sue him. Now the good part. Said nephew's older brother just happens to be an attorney. Pretty convenient. Nephew calls brother, explains the situation, and the brother says he'll look into it. Comes to find out the seller was out of state. The selling price was large enough to be a felony, plus with the shipper selling over state lines, it turns into an interstate commerce violation, which is a federal offense. He sent the seller a typical lawyer letter full of legalese, but pointing out the issue of possible felony and the interstate commerce violation, my nephew had the money back in a few days. And of course, no charge from the family attorney. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.